Vivid verses.
I found it on a Tuesday in the third week of the quarter, doing something I had done 400 times before without incident, reconciling a vendor account against a supplier invoice that had come in 11 days late. The invoice was for consulting services rendered to a subsidiary we use for licensing overseas, a structure I had built myself 6 years earlier, sitting in a conference room with a tax attorney and a legal pad, back when Desmond and I were still drawing our own paychecks by hand. The invoice was for a firm called Corgan Advisory. I did not recognize the name. This by itself meant nothing. We used a rotating bench of consultants for the subsidiary, compliance reviews, transfer pricing opinions, the occasional valuation. New names appeared and disappeared. But the amount was specific in a way that caught my attention before my mind had finished forming the reason. $47,250. Not a round number, not an obviously fabricated one either. The kind of number that looks, to anyone glancing at it, like the honest output of an hourly rate multiplied by actual hours. I pulled the general ledger entry. Then I pulled the wire confirmation. Then, because something in the back of my skull had already started assembling a shape I didn't want to look at directly, I pulled every Corgan Advisory invoice going back 18 months. There were 11 of them, all different amounts, all specific looking, all routed through the subsidiary, the one I had structured, the one that existed for a genuine and defensible reason, the one whose entire architecture I understood the way a locksmith understands a lock he cut himself. I did not feel alarm. I want to be precise about that, because alarm is not what happened. What happened was closer to what happens when you are reading a familiar page of a book and notice for the first time that a sentence doesn't parse. You don't panic. You read it again, slower. I read the 11 invoices again, slower. The subsidiary was called, blandly and deliberately, an international licensing entity. It existed to hold certain intellectual property rights and license them back to the domestic operating company, which let us allocate income in a way our attorney had assured us, correctly I still believed, was both legal and standard practice for a company our size doing the volume of overseas business we did. I had built the org chart. I had drafted the intercompany agreement. I had sat across from an attorney named Priscilla Hanwell for 4 hours while she explained, with the patience of someone paid by the hour to be patient, exactly what could and could not flow through that entity without inviting scrutiny. What could not flow through it was money for services that were never actually performed. I did not know yet, on that Tuesday, that this was what I was looking at. I only knew that Corgan Advisory did not appear in any vendor file I had personal knowledge of, and that the entity through which they were being paid had exactly 2 authorized signatories, myself and Desmond. I closed the file. I made a cup of coffee. I went back to my actual work, which that week involved a renewal negotiation with our largest distributor, and I did that work competently and completely, because one of the things I've always been good at, better I think than Desmond ever gave me credit for, is doing 2 things at once without either one showing on my face. That night, at home, I opened my personal laptop, the one not backed up to the company's share drive, and I typed Corgan Advisory into a search bar. There was almost nothing. A registration in a state neither of us had ever done business in. No website. No employees on any professional networking site. A registered agent address that, when I looked it up, turned out to be a strip mall mailbox service 3 exits off a highway I had never had reason to drive. I sat with that for a while. Not with anger. Anger would come later in small, well-managed doses, and I would not let it near a decision until it had cooled to something usable. What I sat with that first night was closer to recognition. The particular cold recognition of watching a magic trick performed with your own hands by someone who learned the trick from you and then used it on you. The obvious move, the move a lesser version of myself might have made, was to walk into Desmond's office the next morning and put the invoices on his desk and ask him to explain himself. I did not do this, and I want to lay out why, because the reasoning is the entire shape of what came after. If I confronted him, I would be handing him three things simultaneously: warning, time, and control of the narrative. He would have an evening or a weekend, or however long I let elapse between confrontation and any formal action, to construct an explanation. Desmond was not a stupid man. He had co-built a company with me for 11 years. He understood structure, and he understood that a structure built for one purpose can often be repurposed in retrospect to look as though it always served another. He could produce a story, a consulting relationship that existed informally, a verbal agreement I simply hadn't been looped into, a series of payments for something legitimate that had merely been documented sloppily. He could, if given time, produce actual paperwork to support that story, backdated and plausible, because backdating a services agreement is not difficult when you're one of two people who control the entity in question. Worse, he could reframe the confrontation itself as the problem. Two founders, a dispute over a subsidiary that one of them designed, a court, or worse, a boardroom, does not always know which of two very reasonable-sounding men is lying. Confrontation, in other words, was not a move toward clarity. It was a move toward a fight where the outcome depended on which of us told the better story. And I have never liked fights whose outcomes depend on things other than fact. So I decided, very early, within 48 hours of the first invoice, that I would not confront him. I would not raise my voice, would not raise an eyebrow, would not let a single meeting between us carry even a flicker of anything other than the normal, slightly bored competence with which we had run this company for over a decade. I would keep having lunch with him. I would keep laughing in the register I always laughed in at the same jokes he always made about our head of sales. I would let him believe completely that the only thing occupying my attention was the distributor renewal. What I would actually be doing was building a second version of the truth, quietly, in a place he couldn't see, until the moment I chose to let the two versions collide. The first call I made was not to a lawyer. It was to an accountant named Naomi Castellane, who had done forensic work for us once before, years earlier, on an unrelated matter involving a departing employee and an expense account. She was thorough, discreet, and this mattered more than either of those things. She had no social relationship with Desmond. He had met her exactly once at a holiday party for the length of a handshake. I told her I wanted a full reconstruction of the subsidiary's activity for the past 3 years, done under the description of a routine internal audit ahead of a potential financing round, which was not strictly untrue. We had discussed raising a growth round that year, and the subsidiary's books would need to withstand diligence regardless of what I found in them. "Anything specific I'm looking for?" she asked, "or am I just turning over rocks?" "Turn over rocks," I said. "Tell me what doesn't reconcile." It took her 9 days to come back with a preliminary memo. In that time, I did not check in with her more than twice, both times by phone, never by email, because email leaves a shape even when the words themselves are careful. I did not want a shape to exist yet. I wanted to know before anyone else knew that I knew. Her memo, when it arrived, was longer than the 11 invoices I had already found. There were 14 more. There was also a pattern to the licensing revenue itself. Small, deliberate understatements in the numbers reported back to the domestic entity. Understatements that individually would never have triggered a variance flag, but that, compounded over 3 years, amounted to a sum with real weight to it. Weight enough that I sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes after reading it before I went up to the office, because I needed my face to be ready before anyone saw it. I want to be honest that the number itself was not, in the end, the thing that occupied most of my thinking. What occupied my thinking was the mechanism. Desmond had not invented a new scheme. He had taken the exact structure I built, the licensing entity, The two-signatory rule I had insisted on as a safeguard, the intercompany agreement I had drafted specifically to make abuse difficult, and found the one seam in it that only someone who had watched me build it would know to look for. The two-signatory rule required both of us to approve wire transfers over a certain threshold. Every single one of the fake invoices was under that threshold. He had used my caution against me. That, more than the money, was the thing I sat with in the parking garage. Over the following 6 weeks, I did 4 things, none of which Desmond had any reason to notice, because each of them, examined individually, looked like ordinary founder behavior in a company approaching a financing round. The first was documentation. Every conversation I had with Naomi, I had by phone or in person at her office, never at ours. Every memo she produced, I stored on a drive that did not sync to anything the company controlled. I built, slowly, a complete and independently verifiable record. Wire logs, the Shell registration, the mailbox address, a comparison of Corrigan Advisory's supposed billing rate against every actual consulting engagement the subsidiary had ever had, cross-referenced against the calendar entries showing Desmond had, on 10 separate occasions, personally approved and initiated the transfers himself, using the login credentials that were technically mine to share, but that I had for convenience, given him years earlier and never revoked. The second was a quiet conversation with Priscilla Hanwell, the attorney who had originally structured the entity with me. I told her, in the same measured tone I used for everything, that I had discovered activity in the subsidiary that appeared inconsistent with its stated purpose, and that I wanted to understand my legal position, specifically my personal exposure, given that my name sat alongside Desmond's on every governing document. This was not paranoia. If the entity's true activity ever surfaced in an audit or a dispute, a signatory who claimed ignorance without having taken any protective steps would look to an outside observer exactly as culpable as a signatory who had actively participated. I needed the record to show, unambiguously and from an early date, that I had discovered the irregularity and acted on it. Silence with documentation is prudence. Silence without it is complicity. Priscilla listened without interrupting, the way she always had, and at the end she asked me one question: do you want this to end in litigation, or do you want it to end in an exit? An exit, I said. His, not mine. She nodded slowly, the way people do when they are recalibrating the scope of a job. Then we build toward that, quietly. The third thing I did was reposition my own equity and signing authority in increments small enough that each one had a plausible, boring justification attached to it. I proposed at a routine quarterly governance meeting that given our growth, we should formalize a policy requiring dual sign-off on all subsidiary transactions regardless of threshold, framed entirely as a best practice ahead of investor diligence, which it genuinely was. Desmond agreed to this without hesitation, which told me something too. A guilty man who knew precisely how his scheme worked would have recognized, instantly, that tightening the threshold rule closed his only working seam. He agreed anyway, easily, because he did not yet know that I knew, and refusing would have looked strange. I also, over those weeks, quietly revised my own employment agreement, a document that had gone untouched since our 4th year in business, updating my severance terms and buyout provisions under the entirely reasonable pretext of cleaning up legacy paperwork before the race. Desmond signed it during a Thursday afternoon between 2 other meetings, barely reading it, the way people sign things they've stopped believing could ever be used against them. The 4th thing I did was the hardest because it required the most discipline. I kept behaving exactly as I always had. I kept our Friday habit of getting coffee from the place on the corner and complaining about the same supplier. I let him vent to me about his daughter's college applications. I did not let a single flicker of what I now knew enter a single interaction between us, because the entire plan depended on him believing, right up until the end, that nothing had changed. There was a night, about a month in, when he called me, something trivial, a question about the distributor contract, and at the end of the call he said, almost as an afterthought, "You've seemed a little quiet lately. Everything okay?" "Just tired," I said. "The raise stuff is a lot of paperwork." "Tell me about it," he said and laughed, and I laughed too, in the register I always used, and we hung up, and I sat for a moment afterward simply admiring, in a clinical way, how easy it was to be exactly what someone expects you to be. By the 10th week, the structure was complete, though complete is a word I use carefully, because nothing about it was dramatic in the moment of its completion. There was no single decisive act, no locked drawer thrown open. There was simply a Tuesday, another Tuesday, which felt correct to me somehow, on which I signed the final document Priscilla had prepared, an amended operating agreement for the subsidiary that gave me, as the majority equity holder in that entity specifically, a fact true since its founding but never previously exercised, unilateral authority to remove a signatory for cause, with cause, defined in language broad enough to cover exactly what Naomi's memo documented. I had also, by then, quietly arranged something else, a buyer, not a full acquisition. The company wasn't for sale, and I had no interest in selling what I'd spent 11 years building. What I had arranged was a private equity group willing to purchase Desmond's equity stake directly at a fair valuation, in the event that his continued involvement in the company became, in Priscilla's careful phrase, operationally untenable. I had shown them nothing about the fraud. I had shown them growth numbers, the distributor renewal, the shape of a healthy company with one founder eager to consolidate control. They were, if anything, more enthusiastic about a deal involving only one of us. None of this constituted a trap in the sense of something sprung. It was closer to a room being quietly rearranged, piece by piece, while its other occupant sat in an armchair reading a newspaper, until the day the floor beneath that armchair was simply no longer where he remembered leaving it. I did not know, yet, exactly when I would use what I had built. I only knew that I now controlled every lever that mattered, legal, financial, and structural, and that Desmond controlled none of them, and did not know it. The moment came sooner than I expected, and it came, fittingly, because of his own carelessness rather than any action of mine. We were 3 weeks from closing the financing round. The lead investor's diligence team had requested, as diligence teams always do, eventually, a full accounting of related party transactions and subsidiary activity for the trailing 3 years. This was not unusual. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of request I had been quietly preparing for since the day I first opened Naomi's memo, because I had known from the beginning that a financing round was the one event that would force a full accounting whether Desmond wanted one or not. I had simply made sure that when it came, the accounting available to be produced was mine, not his. Desmond, for his part, seemed almost relaxed about the request. He mentioned it to me over coffee, our usual Friday coffee, with the mild irritation of a man anticipating a paperwork burden rather than an exposure. "They want 3 years of related party stuff," he said. "I'll have Corrigan send over their invoices. That should cover the subsidiary side." I remember that this was the only moment in the entire 10 weeks when I felt something close to what a less disciplined man might call satisfaction. He had just told me, unprompted, that he intended to submit fabricated documentation directly to an institutional investor's diligence team, an act that would convert what had, until then, been an internal irregularity into something with federal implications, all on his own initiative, entirely without my involvement. Sounds good, I said, and drank my coffee, and let him walk directly into the room I had already finished rearranging. I did not warn him. I did not need to. Priscilla had structured things so that the diligence request itself would run through a data room I controlled the permissions for. Another small, boring, justifiable piece of the architecture, since I had been the one managing the Raze's operational logistics from day one. When Desmond went to upload the Corrigan invoices, he would find that the folder structure required his documents to be cross-referenced against a vendor verification system Naomi had quietly implemented 3 weeks earlier, ostensibly as part of the audit readiness process. A vendor verification system that would return automatically and without any need for me to say a single word the fact that Corrigan Advisory had no verifiable business registration, no tax filings, no employees, and a registered address at a mailbox rental facility. I found out it happened not because he told me, but because Priscilla called me on a Thursday evening, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone delivering news she has been waiting to deliver for weeks. He tried to push the invoices through this afternoon, she said. The system flagged them automatically. He doesn't know yet that you're aware of any of this. As far as he knows, it's a compliance glitch. How long before he understands it isn't? Hours. Maybe less. He's not stupid. No, I agreed. He isn't. I did not go to his office that evening. I went home, made dinner, and sat at my kitchen table. The same table where, 6 years earlier, I had first sketched the structure of the subsidiary on the back of a napkin while explaining to Desmond, patiently and in good faith, why it would protect us both, and I waited. He called me at 9:40 that night. I let it ring twice before answering, not for effect, but because I was finishing a sentence in an email to Priscilla confirming next steps, and I did not want to answer with anything other than my full, calm attention. Hey, I said. There was a pause on the line, longer than his pauses usually were. Did you know the diligence system is flagging the Corrigan invoices? I saw something come through, I said. This was true. I'd seen everything come through. What's the issue? Another pause. I could hear in the quality of his silence the specific texture of a man doing arithmetic he did not want to be doing. It's saying there's no registration on file for them. That seems like a system error. Probably, I said. Naomi's new verification thing is pretty aggressive. We can sort it out tomorrow. Yeah, he said. Tomorrow. He did not sleep on it, though. I know this because at 6:50 the next morning, before I had even reached the office, Priscilla called to tell me that Desmond had gone into the subsidiary's records himself overnight, from home, using the access he still believed was unrestricted, and had discovered in the process that his signing authority on the entity had been formally amended 3 weeks earlier, that the amendment had been properly executed and filed, and that under its terms, any signatory found to have authorized transactions inconsistent with the entity's documented purpose could be removed for cause by majority holder action, action that had already, quietly, been taken the previous afternoon, the same hour the diligence flag fired. He had discovered, in other words, not the fraud being exposed, but the exit already having been sealed. The fraud was simply the door he happened to be standing next to when he found out the room had already been locked around him. He came into my office at 9 that morning. I remember the specific quality of light through the window behind him, flat gray, the kind of morning that makes everything in a room look slightly overexposed. He did not sit down. We need to talk, he said. Okay, I said, and gestured to the chair across from my desk. He did not take it. The subsidiary access, he said. It's been changed. I know, I said. I made the change. He looked at me for a long moment. I have thought, since, about what he was looking for in my face in that moment. Anger, maybe, or guilt, some sign that this was a mistake or an overreaction he could argue his way out of. He would not have found any of those things because none of them were present. What was present, I imagine, was simply attention. I gave him my full and undivided attention, the way I always had in every meeting we'd ever had, and I let him find, in that attention, whatever conclusion he was capable of reaching on his own. "Corgan Advisory," he said, finally. "I know about Corgan Advisory," I said. "I've known for 10 weeks. I watched something in him recalibrate. Not collapse, not yet. Desmond was too controlled a man to collapse in front of me even then, but recalibrate, the way a chess player recalibrates when he realizes the move he thought was clever was anticipated 4 moves earlier. 10 weeks, he repeated. Give or take. You didn't say anything." "No," I said. "I didn't." He sat down then, finally, in the chair across from me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. I did not fill the silence. I have found, over the years, that the person who fills a silence first is usually the person who needs something from it, and I did not need anything from this one. I already had everything I needed. "What happens now?" he said. "Priscilla will call your attorney this afternoon," I said. "The buyout offer is already prepared. It's fair, more than fair, given the circumstances. You'll want your own counsel to review it, obviously, but I'd encourage you not to delay. The alternative path involves people who don't work for either of us deciding what's fair instead, and I don't think you want that path. You planned this." I responded to what I found, I said. "The planning was yours. I only made sure that by the time you noticed I'd found it, there wasn't anything left for you to do about it." He did not argue with this. I think, in the end, that was the thing I respected least and understood most. He did not argue, because there was nothing to argue with. The invoices existed. The registration didn't. The transfers had his authorization and no one else's. He had built his own case against himself, invoice by invoice, over 3 years, using a structure I happened to have designed for an entirely different reason. And all I had needed to do was notice and wait and make sure that when the moment of noticing became visible to him, it was already too late to matter. He left my office without shaking my hand, which was, I think, the only moment in the entire 11 years of our partnership where he behaved with something like honesty toward me. The buyout closed 6 weeks later. Desmond's attorney negotiated, as I expected he would, for a slightly higher number than the initial offer, and I agreed to it, because the number itself was never the point. Priscilla structured the agreement so that his exit was framed in every document that would ever be seen by an investor or an employee or a journalist as a mutual and amicable transition. No fraud named, no accusation filed, nothing that would require either of us to explain in public what had actually happened in that subsidiary. This was not generosity on my part. It was arithmetic. A public fight would have cost the company more than his silence was worth, and I have never confused principle with strategy when the two happened to point in different directions. He signed the final documents on a Thursday afternoon, in a conference room neither of us had used before. Neutral ground, at Priscilla's suggestion, and when it was done, he looked at me across the table with an expression I could not entirely place, something between resentment and a kind of reluctant, professional respect, the way a man might look at an opponent who beat him at a game he thought only he understood. "You built that structure to protect the company," he said. It was not quite a question. "I built it to protect the company," I agreed. "It did exactly that." He did not say anything else. He gathered his copy of the agreement, and he left, and I sat in the conference room for a few minutes afterward, alone, looking at the closed door. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be precise about that, because triumph implies a kind of loud, expansive feeling, and what I felt was something quieter and, I think, more durable. The specific satisfaction of a structure holding exactly the load it was designed to hold, under conditions it was never explicitly built to withstand, but withstood anyway, because it had been built with enough care in the first place that even its misuse could not break it. That evening, I drove home the way I always did, and I made dinner the way I always did, and I sat at the same kitchen table where I had first sketched the subsidiary structure on a napkin 6 years earlier in good faith for reasons that had turned out, in the end, to matter more than either of us had understood at the time. I did not keep a napkin. I had never needed to. I had built the thing itself to last.
Thanks for listening.